Hi guys, this is part 3 of our Andrew Jackson biography study for this week. And this part I'm going to read from a book called Lives of the Presidents. It says, Andrew Jackson, born in Waxhaw, South Carolina, 1767, died near Nashville, Tennessee in 1845. Lawyer, greatest military hero of his day, and the, quote, people's president, the first whose origins were humble. So that's kind of the lead-in for this article on Andrew Jackson. So I'll begin. Here's a little caricature picture of him with some interesting facts. Notice the parrot. That's going to come up in this. This selection has a little more personal information in it. People he'd grown up with went into shock when they heard the news of the election. Well, if Andrew Jackson can become president, said one former neighbor, anybody can. Ex-presidents feared him as dangerous, and they called him a barbarian. They knew how Jackson had spent his youth fighting, especially with anyone who made fun of his childhood drooling. You know what drooling is. It's when that stuff comes out of your mouth while you sleep. And he enjoyed playing practical jokes. But once he married Rachel Donaldson Robards, the daughter of his landlady, he became more focused and considerate. And after he emerged, nicknamed Old Hickory for his toughness, from his stunning victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans, he was wildly popular among ordinary Americans. Jackson actually married Rachel twice because the first marriage was not considered legal because she had not divorced her first husband officially yet. So he ended up marrying her again after that became official. His opponents kept bringing up this fact in his first vicious campaign. In the first vicious campaign in presidential history. So this was basically the first campaign where they were slinging insults at each other and slinging mud, we call it. When Rachel went shopping for clothes to wear as First Lady, she happened to see a campaign pamphlet and learned of the attacks that had been made against her for being married twice. She became hysterical at the accusations and died within the month of an apparent heart attack, 3 months before Jackson was even inaugurated. So many say now in hindsight, she had that heart attack partly because of all the stress of the horrible, vicious campaign. So she missed the famous riot at his inaugural party when unexpected crowds fought over barrels of orange punch, smashed china and glasses, tracked mud all over the White House furniture, and almost suffocated Jackson. It's quite a wild inauguration. He fled to dine with his friends on sirloin steak from a prize ox and spent his first night as president at a hotel. Jackson grieved for Rachel for the rest of his life, dressed in a black suit and tie, black armband, and black band around his tall beaver hat. A tiny picture of her hung on a black cord next to his heart. He read from her prayer book every night. They had no children, but he adopted his wife's nephew and raised several other children whose parents could not take care of them. They included an Indian boy named Lincoya, whose family was killed during a war with the Creek Indians. Jackson had some 160 slaves also that he brought to the White House with him. He believed that slavery was not a matter for government action. He will be proved wrong in the not too distant future. Assumed to be the president most likely to die in office, although he didn't, Jackson was almost in constant pain. He had headaches, stomach aches, and a hacking cough. You know what a hacking cough is? It's kind of like a cough that just won't go away. By the time he took office, his red hair had gone gray and sometimes appeared to stand up on the top of his head. So a lot of times you'll see pictures of him painted with his hair sticking up a little bit. He was the first president to be the victim of an assassination attempt and the only president ever to kill a man in a duel which was actually fought over Rachel's honor, and the only president to have been a prisoner of war, which he had been during the American Revolution. Besides his numerous scars, Jackson lived with 2 bullets lodged inside him. One he eventually had removed with no anesthesia after 20 years. The other remained near his heart and caused him pain all of his life. Generally, he obeyed doctors' orders as long as they didn't tell him to give up coffee or his tobacco. When he felt too ill for activity, he would use that time for thinking. Sometimes he spent entire days in bed thinking. Once the inauguration fiasco was behind him, Jackson brought improvements to the White House. He added running water and fully equipped bathrooms, a formal garden, a hothouse full of plants, and a $300 piano, which was pretty expensive back then. He had frolics, that's what he called them, for the many children that he knew, playing blind man's bluff and snowball fights with cotton balls. Not a big eater himself, he just would pick at his food. He gave sumptuous candlelight dinners with wild turkey dressed with brains, chicken served with slices of tongue, duck with celery, partridge with sweetbreads. Sweetbreads are not sweet. They're like parts of an animal's pancreas. Pheasant and Virginia ham. And for dessert, small Turkish tarts. He preferred to sit not at the head of the table, but between 2 women whom he could converse with and depend on to be good listeners, but not gossipers. He was an animated conversationalist. He sometimes mispronounced or misused words, and he never got the hang of spelling anything correctly. He insisted that the White House belonged to the people and that anyone should be able to run in at any hour and just shake the president's hand. Of course, that meant sometimes they would see him in old clothes or his feet up on his desk or smoking his favorite corncob pipe, but he enjoyed some pastimes as well while he was a president. He enjoyed racing horses, and he enjoyed raising birds and entering them in fights, and he had a parrot named Paul, or Poll, P-O-L-L, who could talk. To friends, Jackson was always loyal and generous. To enemies, especially anyone who he held responsible for the rumors against Rachel, he was mean and spiteful. The shrieking high pitch of his voice could make him sound out of control. But his deliberate way of turning his temper on and off amazed people who watched him. He used that technique to scare people into doing what he wanted them to do. His thin-skinned, combative ways came in handy, as would his would-be assassin, who was a house painter, who shot at him. Quick-thinking Jackson immediately jumped forward and hit the man with the cane that he used to steady his walk. Probably yelled at him, too, in his high-pitched, screaming voice. His last years were spent at the Hermitage, his large plantation, and they were very uncomfortable last years. He had 1 functioning lung and 1 blind eye, and after his nightly visits to Rachel's grave site, he would sleep propped up because he had trouble breathing. Functioning means only 1 of his lungs worked. The bad market for cotton forced him to borrow money from his friends. Later in life, he formally joined the Presbyterian Church and read many religious books. His dying wish was that he would meet his friends on the other side. His last words were, "Oh, do not cry, be good children, and we shall all meet again in heaven." He died at the age of 78, probably of heart failure, and was buried next to Rachel in the Hermitage Garden. So there you have a little bit more personal and a little bit more entertaining and information that's a little more interesting. As with most very famous people, he had some good points. He also had some bad points. And as we study history and we look at biographies as a type of literature, sometimes you do have to recognize the fact that there are some good and there are some bad things. And so Andrew Jackson was one of those types of presidents. He's famous for some good things. He's famous for some bad things. All right, that concludes our study of the life of Andrew Jackson and how it correlated a little bit with our social studies this week. If you will notice on your spreadsheet, I'm going to send, you're going to write 10 facts that you have learned from this week's study of Andrew Jackson and just put them in your folder of work. Actually, probably next week, I'm going to ask you to turn in your folder of work. And also notice that tomorrow, you are going to have some questions to answer about the social studies, which may include a question or two that comes from Andrew Jackson, as you talked about or as you read about in your social studies workbook. All right. Bye. Take care.